The Middle East today is shaped by one decision. Now imagine if that moment never happened at all. Fact 1. Without the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Saddam Hussein would likely have remained in power for several more years, possibly even into the 2000s. His regime was weakened by sanctions but still firmly in control internally. The United States had shifted toward containment rather than immediate regime change by the late 1990s, and that strategy could have continued. This means Iraq would have stayed a tightly controlled authoritarian state, with limited internal rebellion. For many Americans, this raises a difficult question. Was a contained dictator more stable than the chaos that followed his removal? Fact 2. The absence of invasion would almost certainly have prevented the rapid collapse of Iraq's state institutions. In reality, the disbanding of the Iraqi army and government created a massive power vacuum. Without that collapse, there would have been no sudden breakdown of law enforcement, no widespread looting, and far less immediate instability. Iraq might have resembled other authoritarian states, repressive, but structurally intact. For Americans watching from home, the long-term debate becomes sharper. Stability under control versus instability under forced change. Fact 3. One of the most significant consequences. The group that became ISIS may never have emerged in the same form. The conditions that allowed ISIS to rise, sectarian conflict, disenfranchised Sunni populations and ungoverned territory, were direct results of post-invasion chaos. Without that environment, extremist groups would still exist, but likely fragmented and far less powerful. This means no ISIS caliphate, no mass global recruitment campaign, and potentially fewer terrorist attacks linked to Iraq's instability. The ripple effect would have reshaped global counter-terrorism efforts for decades. Fact 4. The United States itself would look different today, politically, economically, and socially. The Iraq War cost trillions of dollars and deeply affected public trust in government decisions. Without it, those resources could have been directed elsewhere: infrastructure, healthcare, or even different military priorities. Additionally, the intense political polarization fueled by the war might have developed differently. For many Americans, this becomes personal. How different would the country feel today if one of its most controversial wars had never happened? Fact 5. Without the invasion, Iran's regional influence would likely have grown much more slowly. After 2003, Iraq transformed from Iran's enemy into a state heavily influenced by Shia political groups aligned with Tehran. Without that shift, Saddam Hussein would have remained a strong counterbalance to Iran in the region. This could have preserved a more traditional power equilibrium in the Middle East. For Americans, this raises a critical strategic question. Did removing one adversary unintentionally strengthen another far more complex and long-term rival? Fact 6. The US military would not have been stretched across two major wars at once. With no Iraq invasion, resources could have remained focused on Afghanistan and counter-terrorism operations directly linked to the September 11th attacks. This might have allowed for a more concentrated effort against the Taliban and al-Qaeda leadership. Some analysts argue this could have changed the timeline, or even the outcome, of the war in Afghanistan. For many Americans, especially veterans, this becomes a deeply personal what-if about focus, sacrifice, and outcomes. Fact 7. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilian deaths might have been avoided, but not all suffering. Saddam Hussein's regime was responsible for severe human rights abuses, and those would likely have continued. However, the large-scale sectarian violence that erupted after the invasion, particularly between Sunni and Shia groups, may never have reached the same intensity. This creates a difficult moral contrast: ongoing repression under a dictator versus widespread violence after his removal. It forces Americans to confront an uncomfortable question about the cost of intervention versus the cost of inaction. Fact 8. America's global reputation may have remained stronger, especially among allies. The Iraq War was controversial worldwide, with many countries opposing the invasion due to disputed intelligence about weapons of mass destruction. Without that conflict, trust between the United States and key allies in Europe and beyond might have stayed more intact. This could have influenced future cooperation on global issues like security, trade, and diplomacy. For Americans, this is not just foreign policy. It's about how the country is perceived when it chooses to act or chooses not to. Fact 9. Without the invasion, the global energy market might have been more stable in the early 2000s. The war disrupted Iraqi oil production and contributed to uncertainty in global supply, which helped drive price volatility. If Iraq had remained under a controlled regime, its oil exports, though limited by sanctions, would have been more predictable. This could have influenced gasoline prices in the United States during a critical economic period. For American families, this isn't abstract geopolitics. It's about what they paid at the pump every week. Fact 10. The justification for preemptive war would have faced much stronger skepticism going forward. The Iraq invasion was built largely on intelligence about weapons of mass destruction that were never found. Without the war, that specific failure of intelligence would not have become such a defining moment. This means future US military actions might have required a different standard of proof, or perhaps less public resistance. For Americans, this raises a sharp question. Did Iraq ultimately make the country more cautious, or more divided about when to go to war? Fact 11. The internal balance of power in Iraq might have delayed a broader regional awakening. The instability after 2003 contributed to shifts that later influenced movements across the Middle East, including the conditions that fed into the Arab Spring. Without Iraq's collapse, authoritarian regimes in the region may have faced less immediate pressure or fear of similar chaos. This could mean slower political change, but also potentially fewer violent uprisings in the short term. For Americans, it reframes how one decision can echo far beyond its original borders. Fact 12. American military families would have experienced a different decade entirely. Without deployments to Iraq, hundreds of thousands of service members would not have been sent into that specific conflict zone. This means fewer casualties, fewer injuries, and fewer long-term psychological impacts tied directly to Iraq. However, it also means a military less tested in large-scale counterinsurgency operations. For many Americans, especially those connected to the armed forces, this is not theoretical. It's about lives changed, families affected, and sacrifices that may never have been asked. Fact 13. The concept of nation-building by force would likely have remained less defined and less questioned. Iraq became a central example of how difficult it is to rebuild a country after removing its government. Without that experience, US policymakers might have had fewer real-world lessons about the limits of military power in reshaping societies. This could have led to either more confidence in intervention or more uncertainty due to a lack of precedent. For Americans, this becomes a deeper reflection. Did Iraq teach hard lessons that prevented future mistakes, or create divisions that still haven't healed? Fact 14. Without the invasion, the refugee crisis tied to Iraq would have been significantly smaller. After 2003, millions of Iraqis were displaced internally or forced to flee to neighbouring countries and beyond. Without the collapse of the state and the rise of sectarian violence, that mass displacement likely would not have occurred at the same scale. However, repression under Saddam Hussein would still have pushed some people to leave. For Americans, this connects directly to later global debates about immigration, borders, and responsibility in conflicts the United States helps shape. Fact 15. The credibility of US intelligence agencies might have remained stronger in the public eye. The failure to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq became one of the most damaging intelligence controversies in modern American history. Without the invasion, that specific failure would not have been exposed in the same way. This could mean greater long-term trust in intelligence assessments, or less scrutiny of them. For Americans, this becomes a deeper tension. Is it better to question intelligence after a mistake, or trust it more when that mistake never happens? Fact 16. Terrorist recruitment narratives might have looked very different. The Iraq War became a central talking point for extremist groups, used to recruit fighters by portraying the United States as an occupying force in a Muslim country. Without that invasion, those narratives would have been weaker or forced to shift focus. However, anti-American sentiment would not have disappeared entirely. For Americans, this raises a difficult question about cause and effect. Did the war create more enemies than it eliminated, or simply reveal ones that already existed? Fact 17. The structure of Iraq's society might have remained more unified on the surface, but more suppressed underneath. Saddam Hussein's regime maintained control partly by limiting open sectarian conflict, even though deep divisions existed. Without the invasion, those tensions may not have erupted into open civil war, but they would not have been resolved either. This suggests a different kind of stability, one built on control rather than reconciliation. For Americans, it becomes a question of what stability truly means when underlying conflicts are never addressed. Fact 18. Future US foreign policy decisions might have faced less public resistance in the short term, but more risk in the long term. The Iraq War created a generation of Americans deeply skeptical of large-scale military interventions. Without that experience, public opinion might have been more supportive of future operations abroad. At the same time, without the lessons learned from Iraq, policymakers might have repeated similar strategies elsewhere. For Americans, this becomes a powerful what if. Did Iraq prevent future mistakes, or make the country hesitate when action might have been necessary? Fact 19. Without the invasion, the relationship between the United States and the broader Muslim world might have remained less strained in the early 2000s. The presence of American troops in Iraq became a powerful symbol across the region, influencing public opinion far beyond Iraq itself. Without that image, diplomatic engagement may have faced fewer immediate barriers. However, underlying tensions would still exist due to earlier conflicts and policies. For Americans, this raises a difficult reflection. How much did Iraq shape global perception, and how much damage would have existed anyway? Fact 20. The Iraqi economy might have evolved more slowly but with fewer shocks. Under sanctions, Iraq's economy was restricted but functioning at a basic level. Without the invasion, there would have been no sudden collapse followed by chaotic reconstruction. Instead, gradual change, possibly tied to easing sanctions, could have occurred. However, corruption and inefficiency within Saddam's system would likely have continued to limit growth. For Americans, this becomes a question of economic impact. Is slow, controlled development more sustainable than rapid, externally driven transformation? Fact 21. The precedent of removing a government without a clear post-war plan would not have been set in the same way. Iraq became a defining example of how difficult it is to plan for what comes after military victory. Without that experience, US leadership might have had fewer cautionary lessons about post-conflict governance. This could have influenced later decisions in other regions. For Americans, this raises a strategic dilemma. Did Iraq serve as a warning that prevented future miscalculations, or was it a mistake that reshaped policy through painful experience? Fact 22. The Kurdish region in northern Iraq might have followed a different path. After 2003, Kurdish autonomy expanded significantly under US protection. Without the invasion, Kurdish regions would likely have remained under tighter control from Baghdad, with limited political and military independence. This could have reduced tensions with neighbouring countries concerned about Kurdish separatism, but also limited Kurdish self-determination. For Americans, this highlights another layer of complexity: how intervention can empower some groups while destabilizing broader regional balances. Fact 23. The scale and visibility of private military contractors in modern warfare might have remained smaller. The Iraq War saw a significant expansion in the use of contractors for security, logistics, and reconstruction. Without that conflict, this model of outsourcing military support might not have grown as rapidly or as visibly. This has long-term implications for how wars are fought and who is accountable. For Americans, it raises a fundamental question about transparency and control. Who is actually involved when the country goes to war? Fact 24. The long-term psychological impact on American society might have been less pronounced, but also less understood. The Iraq War contributed to national conversations about veterans' mental health, PTSD, and the cost of repeated deployments. Without that conflict, fewer individuals would have faced those specific experiences, but public awareness might have developed more slowly. For Americans, this becomes deeply personal. Did Iraq expose hidden costs that needed to be addressed, or create wounds that might never fully heal? Fact 25. Without the invasion, the concept of shock and awe warfare would not have been tested on such a global stage. The initial phase of the Iraq War demonstrated overwhelming military force designed to rapidly collapse a government. Without this example, future military doctrine might have evolved differently, with less emphasis on rapid dominant strategies. For Americans, this raises a critical debate. Did Iraq prove the effectiveness of overwhelming force, or expose its limits when political outcomes fail to match military success? Fact 26. the divide between intelligence, media, and public trust might have unfolded differently. The Iraq War intensified scrutiny of how information is presented to the American public, especially regarding national security. Without the invasion, the media landscape may have avoided one of its most controversial modern moments. However, this also means fewer lessons learned about misinformation and accountability. For Americans, this becomes a lasting question. Is trust stronger when it is never broken, or when it is challenged and rebuilt? Fact 27. The long-term cost of caring for veterans would have been significantly lower, but so would awareness of their needs. The Iraq War created generations of veterans requiring medical care, disability support, and long-term services. Without that conflict, the financial burden on the system would be reduced. However, public attention toward veterans' healthcare, rehabilitation, and reintegration might not have received the same urgency. For Americans, this creates a tension between cost and responsibility. What is gained when fewer are affected, and what is lost when fewer stories are told? Fact 28. The strategic focus of the United States might have shifted earlier toward other global challenges. Without the prolonged commitment in Iraq, policymakers may have redirected attention sooner to rising powers like China or emerging threats in cybersecurity and technology. This could have reshaped priorities in defense spending and international strategy. For Americans, this raises a forward-looking question. Did Iraq delay preparation for future challenges, or did it define the kind of conflicts the country would need to understand? Fact 29. The narrative of American intervention in the 21st century would look fundamentally different. Iraq became one of the defining events shaping how the world views US power and decision-making. Without it, the United States might be seen as more restrained or less willing to act decisively. This perception would influence allies, adversaries, and global expectations. For Americans, this becomes a question of identity. Is the country defined by its willingness to act, or by its judgment in choosing when not to? Fact 30. The emotional memory of a generation would be different, both in what was experienced and what was avoided. For many Americans, Iraq is not just policy. It is news footage, family conversations, deployments, and loss. Without the invasion, that shared national experience would not exist in the same way, but neither would the lessons, debates, and reflections that came with it. This leaves a final, unresolved tension. Is it better to avoid a defining moment entirely, or to live through it and carry its consequences forward? Fact 31. Without the invasion, the idea of democracy promotion by force would have remained largely theoretical, rather than tested in Iraq. The United States had long supported democratic ideals abroad, but Iraq became a real-world attempt to impose political transformation through military action. Without that example, policymakers might have continued to believe such transitions could be achieved more smoothly. For Americans, this creates a powerful uncertainty. Did Iraq expose the limits of exporting democracy, or discourage efforts that might have worked differently under other conditions? Fact 32. The balance between security and civil liberties inside the United States might have evolved differently. While many domestic security measures were tied to the September 11th attacks, the prolonged wars, including Iraq, helped justify extended surveillance, military spending, and emergency policies. Without Iraq, some of those measures might have faced greater resistance or shorter lifespans. For Americans, this becomes a deeply personal issue. How much freedom are people willing to trade for security? And would that balance feel different without a second major war shaping the national mindset? Fact 33. The long-term relationship between Iraq and the United States might have remained distant but less complicated. Without invasion and occupation, there would be no shared history of reconstruction, conflict, and political involvement at the same scale. Iraq might have remained an adversarial but contained state, similar to other sanctioned nations. For Americans, this raises a subtle but important question. Is it better to have a difficult relationship shaped by deep involvement, or a distant one defined by limited engagement and fewer direct consequences? Fact 34. The global fight against terrorism might have been more narrowly focused but potentially less adaptive. Iraq forced the United States and its allies to confront insurgency, urban warfare, and decentralized threats in new ways. Without that experience, military and intelligence strategies might have remained more traditional and less prepared for evolving tactics. However, it also means fewer opportunities for extremist groups to exploit chaos. For Americans, this becomes a strategic dilemma. Did Iraq strengthen preparedness, or create the very challenges it later had to solve? Fact 35. The question of American responsibility in shaping the world would feel fundamentally different today. Iraq became a defining moment that forced the country to confront the consequences of its power, both intended and unintended. Without that invasion, the United States might still be seen as a dominant force, but without the same level of self-examination. For Americans, this is not just history, it is identity. What does it mean to lead globally if one of the most controversial decisions never happened at all? So was Iraq a mistake, or the lesson that changed everything? Decide carefully.